So great to be here. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you for finding me. It's great to see the great work that is coming out of the KIC and really uniting us and trying to understand how these really uncertain times are going to affect our world. So I'm here to talk to you very briefly about our COMBO initiative, or COVID-19 Mother-Baby Outcomes Initiative, that we spearheaded at Columbia University. Lauren found me because we had one early grant, NIH grant, to study brain behavioral functioning, and I will tell you a little bit about this. But broadly speaking, as you'll see, this is a much, much bigger initiative than that. So I wear a lot of different hats at Columbia University, but one of them is as a basic neuroscientist, I actually study the neural circuits of resilience, and that is all I did pretty much up until the pandemic in my lab. And then the second one is I am one of the newborn hospitalists in our well baby nursery. So I'm not a neonatologist. I don't deal with sick babies. I deal with healthy babies 20% of my time. And before the pandemic, I used to say that this was my vacation time away from the lab where things are never working out. And I get to spend time with new parents and their adorable little babies. But on March 13, 2020, that all changed. So I'm not sure the composition of the room in terms of whether or not you're from New York or are familiar with the fact that we were the first epicenter, including for pregnant and laboring women. So March 13, 2020 is actually the date in our country that the very first woman that a woman in labor was first diagnosed with COVID-19. And so that baby was coming to our nursery, and the world was, of course, looking towards our nursery to come up with the protocols, the infection and prevention protocols, as well as just learning from our experience in terms of what to expect from these babies. And so as a neuroscientist and developmental um, uh, neuroscientist in particular, one of the things that, of course, I immediately thought about is the concept of the developmental origins of health and disease, or DOHAD, also called prenatal programming, where we have really learned in the last couple of decades that virtually anything that happens to mom while she is pregnant can affect the fetus. So viruses and the consequent maternal immune activation are some of the insults, and there's lots of examples from the literature. Zika, for example, even in children that are not actually infected with the Zika virus, is associated with language deficits. A variety of viruses have been associated with psychotic disorders all the way into adulthood. And there's many other examples. We also know that things like natural experiments to any kind of stressor, like famine or natural disasters, war, also has been associated with increased risk to the offspring, including schizophrenia, language and cognitive deficits, and difficult infant temperament. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic was this perfect intersection of both of these really influential insults during pregnancy. As we were going into the summer of 2020, we also began to think about just being born into an altered world. So adverse childhood experiences have been shown to be dose dependently involved in the increased risk of different diseases and disorders. Some of the things that you can think about very easily, like depression and anxiety, but also they increase the risk of things like cancer and even broken bones later in life. And so we very rapidly mobilized to start COMBO. The very first dyad was actually enrolled on May 26, 2020. We began with simple phone calls that we physicians were making to our families that had been hospitalized in our well baby nursery just to check up on the baby. We rapidly began to add surveys. We also included a prenatal arm to enroll pregnant individuals. And then we've sort of been chasing this cohort ever since then, and we just began our 4 to 5 year assessment now. And as funding became available, we began to add various things like biospecimens, video visits, brain MRIs of both moms and babies, cool stuff like smell testing of the mothers, And we also have allowed entry point at every time point through the 24-month time point to really capture as big of a population as we can. Um, We've been very fortunate to have early and sustained funding since basically spring of 2020 through both federal and non-federal funds. And most importantly, this is a very, very big initiative. This is actually the picture of Combo from the summer of 2020, which contains 77 people. We are now well over that. So we've had about 200 contributing members to date. We've enrolled 2,000 mother baby dyads. We were able to expand outside of New York into Utah and Alabama thanks to a CDC contract. And we just gather so much data that we don't know what to do with it. So if anybody here is interested in collaborating with us, we're completely open source and open science approach, minus the fact that I don't have the infrastructure to generate DTAs fast enough and be able to set up collaborations fast enough. But we are really interested in any kind of collaborative effort. We've generated over 20 publications at this point, and we've had many trainees that have used this data for their thesis, for their T32s and K99s. And we've generated some of the most foundational data on what is happening to the COVID-19 generation. This is coverage from an early paper that I'll talk to you a little bit about today. And what I'm going to do, because this is only a 10-minute talk, is I'm going to cover 4 papers in one each, just to kind of give you the highlights of some of the biggest findings that we've had. So this is our first paper that we put together in exactly 14 days in April of 2020 in order to look at the rate of vertical transmission. So if mom has COVID while she is pregnant and delivering, is the infant at higher risk of infection? So in this study, we looked at the electronic health records of the first 101 infants born to COVID positive moms at Columbia University. So these babies were born in March and April 2020, which was that really acute peak of the first peak of the pandemic. And as I mentioned, there were 101 infants born during that time. That was a period of about 6 weeks that we looked at, the first 6 weeks of the pandemic. And the most important part about this research is that we were one of the only hospitals that did not separate moms and babies. And so we really felt that this was an important thing to look at very early on, both to protect our own patients, but also to contribute to the research necessary in order for the rest of the world to follow suit and stop the separation, which we know is very dangerous to separate moms and babies. And what we found was that there was a very low risk of vertical transmission, and the 2 babies that did test positive did not have any symptoms. And so this was work that contributed to changes in policy, including by the CDC and World Health Organization, and the ending of the mother-baby separation. I also have the QR codes for each of the 4 papers, forgot to mention. So if you're interested to see the rest of the manuscript, feel free to take a snapshot. The next paper that I'm going to tell you about came out in January of 2022. And this was the first paper worldwide, really, to look at the neurodevelopment of these infants. And for this paper, we used the ASQ3, or Ages and Stages Questionnaire, which is widely used in both clinical settings as well as research settings, as online surveys filled out by mothers. This was specifically targeting 6-month-olds born between March of 2020 and December of 2020. And this was restricted to our population around Columbia University. In this paper, we covered 317 infants, 141 that we knew had not been exposed to COVID in utero. And I'm not going to go through it, but if anybody has questions, we have some of the world's most characterized maternal infection for the year of 2020, thanks to both hospital policies that implemented very early universal testing as well as research strategies. We had 114 infants that we knew to be exposed either in the first, second, or third trimester to maternal infection. And we also were very fortunate to be able to include 62 infants that had been born in our hospital system in the preceding 3 years before the pandemic. And to summarize a finding of this paper, we found no effects of COVID exposure, but we did see some small decrements in pandemic-born children. So this indicated to us that it might be the maternal stress or distress experienced during pregnancy because of the pandemic, rather than an actual viral infection effect. But of course, that was maternal report, and the gold standard in the field is to actually test infants with objective measures of development with actual neurodevelopmental assessments performed by either clinical or research staff. And so in this second paper, we followed up using an observational tool called a DAISY-2. For those of you who might know a little bit about child development, they're very similar to Bayley's, but we were able to adapt the DAISY-2s more easily to conduct them over Zoom. We are still going to be looking at infants that are 6 to 12 months old, so still very young. And we've expanded a little bit in this paper on the date of birth. So we have infants born between March of 2020 and November of 2021. We also expanded in this paper into Utah and Alabama, so really nice geographic coverage, and have a larger sample size of a total of 407 infants. Unfortunately, here we did not have any pre-pandemic born infants, but we have a nice division between unexposed and exposed infants, and then a small group of infants who we don't know their exposure status, so we consider them a separate group. The really good news about this paper was that we found absolutely no effects of COVID exposure, once again, with this much more expanded assessment. So this unfortunately made much less worldwide news because it was only good news. But this was really a phenomenal finding to have this very thorough assessment show no differences between groups. And finally, I'm going to tell you about a paper that came out just a few months ago, and this is the world's first paper evaluating the possible increased risk in autism screening rates in both pandemic-born infants as well as by COVID status. So here we use both electronic health records as well as our combo cohort with online surveys. We looked at infants between 16 and 30 months of age. The date of births for all the infants that we looked at for the electronic health records was January 2018 to September 2021. So these infants, of course, were born at Columbia University, but also followed up within our clinic system. We had about 2,000 infants total between the electronic health records and our combo cohort. And the really good news here is that we found absolutely no effects of either COVID or the pandemic environment. So this was really good news. Unfortunately, it's very hard to make a good career as a scientist with negative findings, but this was the best negative finding of my career. So I will just end by saying that this, just showing you this infographic of our collaborations. We are happy and thrilled when people want to join us. We've been adding a variety of components to this cohort based on the investigators that come and are interested in working with us. And with that, I will thank all of the many contributors and our funders, and please follow us at Combo Study on X/Twitter, or if you just Google Columbia and Combo will be the first thing that comes up.